Welcome to Day 50 episode as we continue our journey through Leviticus. We'll be covering chapters 19, 20, and 21, and unpacking the laws about holiness, justice, and how the Israelites were supposed to live as a distinct people.
That's right. Leviticus often gets a bad rap for being tough to read, but there's so much valuable wisdom in these chapters. So today we'll focus on how these laws set a standard for holiness and how they apply to community life. Where do you think we should start?
Let's start with Leviticus 19. This chapter is all about the call to holiness. It begins with God telling Moses to speak to the people and say, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Now, this is a huge idea. Holiness wasn't just about rituals or sacrifices. It was about living in a way that reflected God's character.
Exactly. And one of the first things God tells them is to honor their parents and keep the Sabbaths. These are foundational to community life, right? Honoring your parents, respecting time for rest, and making sure that relationships stay intact. This speaks to a culture of care and respect.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there. God also warns them against turning to idols and making molten gods for themselves. It's a reminder that their worship needs to be directed only toward God. And this idea is repeated throughout the chapter. I am the Lord your God. It emphasizes that everything they do should point back to Him.
Absolutely. Then we get to the peace offerings. The instructions are pretty specific here. The sacrifice must be eaten the same day, or at least by the next day. If it's eaten on the third day, it's an abomination. It shows that offerings need to be treated with reverence and they can't just be taken lightly.
Right. And then the chapter turns to how they should treat others, especially the poor and the foreigners. The instruction not to harvest the corners of the field or gather every grape, but to leave some for the poor is a powerful message about generosity and inclusion.
It's about being aware of others' needs and showing mercy. There's no room for greed. You can see this concept of giving back and caring for the marginalized woven through the laws in Leviticus.
Moving on to chapter 20, we see some really harsh consequences for certain sins. For example, if someone sacrifices their children to Molech, they're put to death. It sounds intense, but it's also an indication of how seriously God takes the purity of His people. This isn't just about following laws, it's about keeping the community pure from evil practices.
And then there are the laws on sexual immorality, right? Adultery, incest, same-sex relations, and even bestiality are all condemned. The stakes are high because these practices threaten the holiness of the community. They were meant to safeguard relationships and purity within Israel.
Exactly. The penalty for those actions is death, which seems severe to us, but it was meant to emphasize the seriousness of maintaining a holy and set-apart life. God was calling His people to be distinct from the nations around them, who engaged in these very practices.
That's an important point. Leviticus 20 specifically warns the Israelites not to follow the customs of the people around them. It's about living in a way that reflects God's values, not just blending in with the culture of the surrounding nations.
And we can't forget the part where it talks about distinguishing between clean and unclean animals. This chapter gives detailed instructions about what's considered pure and impure, and it's tied to the bigger theme of holiness. It's about being mindful of what you're associated with, even in the everyday things.
And it all circles back to being holy as God is holy. These laws weren't arbitrary. They were meant to protect the Israelites from practices that would harm their relationship with God and one another. They were setting a standard for how to live in community.
Absolutely. Which brings us to chapter 21, where God speaks to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and gives them instructions about how to conduct themselves. For example, priests weren't allowed to defile themselves for the dead, except for close relatives. They were set apart for a higher purpose.
And they were to maintain their holiness in very specific ways. No shaving their heads, no cutting their beards, and no cutting their flesh. These were ways of marking their distinction. It's like a visible reminder of their calling to be holy.
Exactly. The priests had to maintain a higher standard because they were representatives of God to the people. And this continued in how they were to conduct their personal lives, especially in marriage. The priests were not allowed to marry certain women, like prostitutes or divorced women. It was about maintaining their sanctity.
It's fascinating because the idea of holiness wasn't just for the priests. Everyone was called to holiness. The priesthood was meant to reflect what God wanted for the entire community. If the priests were holy, they could lead others in holiness.
That's right. And the chapter also speaks about priests with physical defects, how they weren't allowed to offer sacrifices. This doesn't mean they were excluded from God's love, but it's another example of the standards that were in place for serving in the tabernacle.
And there's a deep symbolism in all of this. It's not about punishing people with defects or flaws. It's about reflecting the perfect holiness of God and how they approach the sacred duties. The people's lives were to reflect the purity and excellence of God in every aspect.
Sometimes we look at Leviticus and wonder how these laws apply to us today. We might not have sacrifices or purity laws, but the deeper themes, like living a holy life, showing mercy, and maintaining justice, are still relevant. We're still called to reflect God's character in our daily lives.
Definitely. The big takeaway here is the call to be different, to live out a life that's distinct from the world. Whether it's honoring parents, showing kindness to strangers, or standing firm in our moral values, Leviticus sets a high bar for community living. It's a powerful reminder of how God wants us to live together in holiness.
It really is. And with that, we'll wrap up our discussion for today. We hope you've gained some new insights into these chapters and how they challenge us to live a holy and just life. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone. Keep reflecting on these timeless truths. God bless.